Sometimes a picture is just a picture, until it's not. At first glance, this one might seem like any other photo of a plane taking off. You've probably seen dozens just like it, nothing too special. But look again. There's something about this one that just doesn't sit right. You ever get that sense that something's off, but you can't tell exactly why? Yeah, this is one of those moments. Now, if you were just flipping through photos, you might not give it a second thought, but once you know the story behind this image, you'll never look at it the same way again. So, take a closer look. It's not just a plane lifting off from the runway. There's something missing. And no, I don't mean figuratively. There's something very, very wrong with this picture, but you'll only see it if you know where to look. Let's set the stage. It's May 25th, 1979, a typical Friday afternoon in Chicago. At O'Hare International Airport, everything seemed business as usual. Families were saying their goodbyes, business travelers were checking their watches, and ground crews were prepping planes for departure. It's the kind of scene you'd find at any major airport. Among the many flights scheduled that day was American Airlines Flight 191, set to fly from Chicago to Los Angeles. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-1010. Now, the DC-10 wasn't a flashy aircraft, but it was known as a workhorse, reliable, sturdy, and capable of carrying hundreds of passengers across long distances. This particular plane had logged just under 20,000 hours of flying time over 7 years since its delivery in 1972. It was powered by 3 General Electric CF66D engines, which were typically considered robust. On board were 258 passengers, each with their own story, some heading home, others on business trips or vacations. There were also 13 crew members, professionals who had done this 1,000 times before. This was just another day at work for them. In command was Captain Walter Lux, age 53. With over 22,000 flight hours under his belt, Lux had been flying the DC-10 since it was first introduced. He knew the aircraft inside and out. Alongside him were First Officer James Dillard, age 49, and Flight Engineer Alfred Udovich, age 56. Both were highly experienced, with thousands of hours in the cockpit. Dillard had logged over 9,000 flying hours, while Udovich had more than 15,000. This crew was as seasoned as they come, with years of experience across multiple aircraft. Now here's something interesting about the DC-10. By 1979, the plane had a bit of a mixed reputation. While it was widely used by airlines, it had been involved in a few incidents that raised questions about its design. Mechanical issues had popped up here and there, but nothing to suggest any major problems. On the day of Flight 191's departure, the maintenance records showed no discrepancies, at least none that anyone knew about. In fact, the aircraft had undergone regular maintenance, and there didn't seem to be any major concerns. But there was one thing. The flight records, which should have been removed before takeoff, were left on board. A minor violation of procedure, but nothing that raised alarms. With everything set and the checks complete, Flight 191 was cleared for takeoff. The passengers settled into their seats, some chatting, others reading or gazing out the window. The engines powered up, and the plane began its slow taxi toward runway 32R. It was a perfect day for flying. Clear skies, good weather, and a straightforward route ahead. As the plane lined up for takeoff, everything appeared normal. The engines roared to life, and the plane surged down the runway, gaining speed. For the passengers watching from the terminal and anyone else on the ground, it looked like just another successful departure. But then, something strange happened. The number 1 engine on the left wing, along with its entire pylon assembly, had broken away from the wing. The engine ripped away a 3-foot section of the leading edge of the wing as it tore off and flipped over the top of the aircraft before crashing back down onto the runway. The plane was in serious trouble before it had even fully left the ground. The plane continued to lose altitude, and in just a matter of seconds, it became clear that the worst was about to happen. The aircraft, now barely 30 seconds into the air, was on a collision course with the ground. Inside the cockpit, the flight crew must have known instantly that something was horribly wrong. But the exact details of their conversation in those final moments, we'll never know. The cockpit voice recorder lost power the moment the engine detached, cutting off any recordings. The only thing captured was a loud thump, likely the sound of the engine separating, followed by the first officer's exclamation, "Damn!" And then, silence. That power loss also explains why the crew never responded to radio calls from air traffic control. They were too busy fighting to keep the plane in the air, but without power to critical systems, it was a losing battle. Now, think about this. The passengers might have seen all of this unfolding. The cockpit had a closed-circuit television camera installed, showing a view of the flight deck to passengers in the cabin. It's possible that they were watching the chaos in the cockpit on their screens as the aircraft rolled and began its deadly descent. Whether the camera lost power along with the cockpit systems is unclear, but it's a chilling thought. In the cabin, panic must have spread as the plane tilted and the ground rushed toward them. For the crew, there was no time to recover. With no hydraulic control, a stalled wing, and critical systems offline, there was nothing more they could do. In just 31 seconds from the moment the engine separated, American Airlines Flight 191 slammed into a field around 4,600 feet from the end of the runway. The impact was catastrophic. The plane's nearly full load of 21,000 gallons of fuel ignited upon impact, creating an enormous fireball visible from miles away. The wreckage scattered across the field, with large pieces of debris thrown into a nearby trailer park, destroying several trailers and cars. The plane even struck an old storage hangar at the edge of the airport. The destruction was total. Other than the engines and parts of the tail section, there were no sizable pieces of the plane left. Everything was consumed in the explosion, leaving behind a field of twisted metal, burning fuel, and smouldering debris. All 271 people on board were killed instantly, and 2 more people on the ground lost their lives as the debris tore through the trailer park. It was a scene of utter devastation, one that left firefighters and emergency responders with little to do but contain the blaze. The crash of Flight 191 had just become the deadliest aviation disaster in US history. The National Transportation Safety Board launched a deep investigation, and by December 1979, they had their findings. It wasn't just one thing that caused the disaster. It was a series of failures. The root of it all? Improper maintenance. The engine that broke off wasn't just a random malfunction. It had been damaged by improper maintenance procedures long before takeoff. When that engine detached, it tore off part of the wing and caused the slats on the left wing to retract. The plane couldn't recover from that. For the families of the victims, the report was important, but it didn't bring back their loved ones. It was a reminder that this tragedy didn't have to happen. It led to massive changes in how planes were maintained and probably saved lives in the long run, but it was too late for those on Flight 191. For more than 30 years, there was no permanent memorial for the victims. It wasn't until 2009 that a group of 6th graders from Decatur Classical School in Chicago raised the money to make it happen. Their effort was incredible, and in October 2011, a memorial wall was finally dedicated. It sits by Lake Opeka, just 2 miles from the crash site, engraved with the names of all 273 victims. On the 40th anniversary of the crash in 2019, a remembrance ceremony was held there, honouring those who lost their lives that day. The impact of Flight 191 goes beyond the lives lost. It changed aviation forever, forcing airlines and manufacturers to address flaws in how planes were built and maintained. It's a tragedy that could have been prevented, but it did lead to changes that probably saved countless lives in the years that followed. Now, Remember how we started with that photo? At first, it seemed like just another image of a plane taking off, but now that you know the full story, it's impossible to see it the same way. The left engine, it's gone. And that small detail, the missing engine, is what turned this ordinary image into a snapshot of disaster. The haunting thing about that photo is how it freezes the moment right before everything went wrong. For the people on board, there was still hope in that instant. The plane was in the air. But knowing what we know now, the photo captures not just a takeoff, but the beginning of an incredibly unfortunate tragedy. You've probably seen this photo, a young black boy, tears streaming down his face, hugging a police officer during a protest. It was one of those moments that seemed to say so much without words. Captured in the heat of nationwide protests against police brutality in 2014, it quickly went viral. The boy in the picture? 12-year-old Devonte Hart. The photo was hailed as a symbol of hope, of healing, even unity. People called it the hug felt round the world, a snapshot of peace in a time of chaos. But, like so many things that go viral, there was more to this image than met the eye. Beneath the heartwarming scene was a far more tragic story, one that would shock the world when the truth finally came out. Devonte wasn't just an emotional kid at a protest. He was a boy living through suffering and pain behind closed doors. And his story, along with that of his family, would turn this picture from a symbol of hope to something much darker. And the deeper we go, the more unsettling the truth becomes. From the outside looking in, the Hart family seemed like they had it all together. Jennifer and Sarah Hart, a married couple, adopted 6 black children, 3 boys and 3 girls. And their social media was packed with photos of their family on road trips, camping in the wilderness, or just having fun days out. They seemed like this quirky, progressive family who stood for everything good: love, acceptance, activism. But it wasn't just their activism that caught people's attention. Jennifer often talked about homeschooling their kids, claiming that she and Sarah were all about nurturing creativity, independence, and emotional growth. Her posts were filled with motivational quotes about kindness and empathy, and people loved following their journey. The picture they painted was of this adventurous, loving family filled with positive vibes and unity. But if you looked a little closer, things didn't seem as perfect as they appeared online. People who knew them in real life started noticing odd things. The kids were homeschooled, but some neighbours said they hardly ever saw them outside. There were whispers, quiet ones, about whether everything was as happy and healthy as the Harts made it look. But with their picture-perfect posts, it was easy for those concerns to be brushed aside. For those who were paying attention, though, something didn't quite add up. The happy, carefree image they put out to the world started to show cracks, and what was hidden beneath would eventually shock everyone. The trouble started showing up years before anyone really took notice. Back in 2008, when the family was living in Minnesota, a teacher noticed bruises on Hannah's arm. When she asked Hannah what happened, the young girl said Jennifer had hit her with a belt. That should have been a huge red flag, but instead of facing more questions, Jennifer and Sarah pulled all 6 of their kids out of school. They were out for more than a year. And this wasn't a one-time thing. In 2010, another one of the Hart children, Abigail, told someone she had owies on her back and stomach. She said she was scared of the Harts because they'd beaten her, and if that wasn't bad enough, they held her head under cold water as punishment for a penny they thought she stole. When authorities finally got involved, all the kids admitted they were being spanked constantly and deprived of food. But once again, Jennifer and Sarah managed to slip through the cracks. Sarah took the blame, pled guilty to assault, and was given nothing more than community service. After that, the family kept a low profile for a while, but the abuse didn't stop. By 2011, things took another turn. Hannah, the same girl who had been bruised years earlier, told a school nurse she hadn't eaten all day. When the nurse asked Jennifer and Sarah about it, they brushed it off, saying Hannah was just playing the food card and suggested she only be given water. Not long after that, the Harts pulled all the kids out of school again, this time for good. From then on, they were homeschooled, and even fewer people had a chance to see what was really happening behind closed doors. In 2013, Oregon authorities got wind of the abuse reports from Minnesota and decided to investigate. They interviewed the family, friends, and people who knew them. Some of the stories were unsettling. The kids had strict rules. They had to raise their hands before they could speak. They couldn't even wish each other a happy birthday, and they weren't allowed to laugh at the dinner table. Neighbors said the kids looked too small for their ages, like they weren't being fed enough. One friend remembered Jennifer ordering a pizza for the kids, but they were only allowed to have a tiny slice each. When the pizza was gone, she punished them by skipping breakfast the next day and making them lie in bed for 5 hours. Even worse, the people who knew the family said the kids seemed terrified of Jennifer. They described them as acting like trained robots, afraid to make a wrong move. Despite all this, the investigation didn't go anywhere. The kids didn't mention any recent abuse, and Jennifer had an explanation for everything. She said their problems were because people didn't understand them. After all, they were a white lesbian couple raising 6 black kids. In the end, no action was taken, and the family moved on. But the signs didn't go away. After the Harts moved to Woodland, Washington, they met their neighbors, Dana and Bruce DeKalb. It wasn't long before Devonte, the same boy from the famous free hugs photo, started coming to their house, asking for food. He told the DeKalbs that his mums were punishing him and his siblings by withholding meals. He begged them not to tell Jennifer, clearly terrified of what might happen if she found out. It wasn't just Devonte. His sister, Hannah, ran away in the middle of the night, barefoot, and jumped out of a second-story window to escape. She ran to the DeKalbs, begging for help, and saying she was being abused. That's when the DeKalbs realized something was seriously wrong, and they decided to report the Harts to both the police and Child Protective Services. In March 2018, CPS tried to intervene. They visited the Hart home twice after the DeKalbs report, but nobody answered the door. And, just like before, the Harts were getting ready to leave, keeping their secrets locked behind closed doors. By March 2018, it was clear that the Hart family's perfect image was falling apart. CPS had gotten involved, the kids had been begging for food, and it seemed like Jennifer and Sarah couldn't keep up the facade much longer. But no one could have imagined just how things would end. On March 26, 2018, Jennifer Hart drove their family's GMC Yukon off a 100-foot cliff on the rugged California coast. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, and all 6 of their kids were in the back. The car went speeding off the edge and crashed upside down on the rocks below. 5 of the children, Marcus, Abigail, Jeremiah, Sierra, and Hannah, were found either in or near the wreckage. But Devonte, the boy whose hug with a police officer went viral just a few years earlier, was missing. His body has, to this day, never been found. As investigators began piecing together what had happened, the story got even darker. The SUV's internal computer showed that Jennifer had stopped the car right at the edge of the cliff. Then, with the gas pedal pushed all the way down, she drove straight off. There was no hesitation, no brake marks. She knew what she was doing and took not only her own life, but her entire family's life too. The case was ruled a murder-suicide by a unanimous coroner's jury. When the toxicology reports came in, it painted an even grimmer picture. Jennifer, the one driving, had a blood alcohol level over the legal limit. Sarah and two of the children had high levels of diphenhydramine, a drug found in Benadryl, which makes people drowsy. And then there were Sarah's Google searches. In the days leading up to the crash, she had looked up things like, how much Benadryl does it take to kill someone? And, what does drowning feel like? She even searched for no-kill shelters for dogs, leaving behind the family pets in their home. It was clear this was no spur-of-the-moment decision. Jennifer and Sarah had planned this. The pressures were mounting, CPS was investigating, the accusations of abuse were piling up, and it seems like they saw no way out. According to one report, Sarah had even confided in a co-worker not long before the crash. She said she wished someone had told her it was okay not to have a big family, and that if they hadn't adopted the kids, none of this would have happened. It's heartbreaking to think about how it all ended. 5 young lives were lost in an instant, and Devonte's fate remains a mystery. His body was never found, but authorities are certain he was in the SUV when it went over the edge. The case was officially closed in 2019 when the Mendocino County Sheriff's Department released the final records. There would be no criminal charges because everyone responsible had died in the crash. But what still lingers are the questions. Why did it come to this? How did a family that seemed so full of life and love end in such devastation? And then, there's that photo, the one that spread across the world, showing Devonte Hart, tears streaming down his face, hugging a police officer during a protest. It was seen as a symbol of hope and unity, a young boy offering love and peace in a time of deep division. But now, knowing everything that we do, it's impossible not to wonder. Were those really tears for the world, for the desire for peace and acceptance for all? Or were they tears for something much closer to home? Maybe, in that moment, Devonte wasn't just hugging an officer as a call for change. Maybe he was clinging to him, desperate for escape, desperate to break free from the torment and abuse he and his siblings were suffering behind closed doors. Was that hug a cry for help no one recognized at the time? We'll never know for sure. But what we do know is that behind the smiles and the public appearances, Devonte and his siblings were living a nightmare. So, as we look back at that famous photo, it's not hard to see it differently now. Their cries for help went unheard for too long, and by the time the truth came out, it was already too late. Before we jump into this final story, I want to give a quick shout out to one of my Patreon supporters. She shared this photo and the story of Brian Davis with me, and honestly, I had never heard of it before. The details she provided painted such a heartbreaking picture, and I'm really grateful she brought it to my attention. So thank you for giving me the chance to tell this important story. This photo might look like a simple group of people getting ready for a trip. They're smiling, holding a sign that reads, "Leaving for the agricultural mission." Maybe it feels like they're off to start a new life, something that feels wholesome, like working on a farm, building a community, and living off the land. The kind of thing that gives people hope for a fresh start. But what you're actually looking at is far more unsettling. These people weren't going on just any mission. They were headed to a place called Jonestown, deep in the jungles of Guyana. And while that name might sound familiar to some, what really happened there would shock the world. This picture was taken right before they left, capturing the moment before everything changed. What they thought was going to be a new beginning was something much darker, something they could never have predicted. And in the days that followed, the true nature of Jonestown would be revealed, leaving this image as one of the last traces of their hope and innocence. Jonestown was supposed to be a paradise, a place where people could escape the pressures of the outside world and live in harmony. That was Jim Jones's vision, the charismatic leader of the People's Temple. He promised his followers a utopia deep in the jungle of Guyana, far away from the chaos of everyday life. And for many, that dream was enough to follow him to the ends of the earth. The sign in this photo, leaving for the agricultural mission, represents the hope Jones offered. He convinced people they were heading off to build a new life, one built on equality, cooperation, and the idea of creating something better together. People from all walks of life believed in that vision, thinking they were part of a movement that could change the world. But underneath all those promises, things were very different. What was sold as a peaceful, agricultural mission quickly turned into something much darker. Life in Jonestown wasn't the paradise everyone had imagined. The settlement was isolated, cut off from the rest of the world, and the people there were under Jim Jones's tight grip. What was meant to be a safe haven became a place of fear and control. Jones wasn't just a leader, he was obsessed with power. He demanded absolute loyalty and would do anything to keep his followers in line. People were subjected to strict rules, exhausting work, and constant surveillance. Anyone who dared to question him or think about leaving was punished, and the consequences could be severe. Even with all that, many people held on. They still believed in the dream they'd been sold. But over time, the cracks started to show. The promise of paradise slowly faded, replaced by the harsh reality of living in the jungle. Food and supplies became scarce, tensions rose, and people began to realize that the utopia they'd been promised wasn't real at all. That photo, capturing the smiles, the excitement, and the hopeful sign, shows a moment when people still believed. As they boarded those flights to Jonestown, none of them could have imagined what was really waiting for them. The faces in that photo tell us a lot, but there's one that stands out, not because of a smile, but because of its seriousness. On the far right is Brian Davis. He's squinting slightly in the sunlight, his expression neutral. You might not immediately notice anything unusual about him, but his story is one that started long before Jonestown and carried all the way through to the end. Brian and his best friend, Tom Bogue, met long before Jonestown. It was back in San Francisco, at the church on Geary Street, where they both lived. Tom had been sent there after running away from home, and at 13, he already hated the church. Brian felt the same. They were instant friends, bonding over late-night TV shows like Night Gallery and The Twilight Zone. Both of them loved music, and they were gearing up to start high school together at Presidio High. They were just regular kids trying to find something good in a situation that was far from it. The church was strict and confining, but that didn't stop them from sneaking out whenever they could. Brian and Tom found a hole in the church fence, their secret passage to freedom. They'd spend hours exploring San Francisco, hopping on buses without paying and heading down to the old China bathhouses on the beach. Those stolen moments of freedom kept them going, even though they always had to sneak back into the church at the end of the day. Life inside the church wasn't easy. Both of them hated the place. Brian especially wanted to go back to his mum's house, but his dad wouldn't let him. That weighed on him, and although the church tried to break their rebellious spirits, they stayed strong. The punishments, like picking lint from the carpet all night after being caught sneaking out, or scraping up old linoleum after smoking, only made them more determined to escape for good. So, they hatched a plan. They started stealing money from the church collection cans every Saturday, just a couple of dollars at a time, to save up for Brian's bus ticket. After months of planning, the day finally came. They slipped out of the church like they always did, headed for the hole in the fence. But when they got there, it had been patched up. Brian then came up with a distraction. He made a noise loud enough to send the guard running. Tom crouched behind a nearby car, his heart pounding. A moment later, Brian ran up to him, yelling, "Let's go!" And they were off, sprinting through the gate and disappearing into the city. They laughed as the adrenaline kicked in. They had done it. They were finally free. They made their way to the Greyhound station, and with shaking hands, Brian bought his ticket. It was real. He was going home. Then they went to Tom's uncle's house, where they explained everything. Tom's uncle and aunt were shocked, but willing to help. They even offered Tom a place to stay, giving him an out from the church too. For the first time in a long while, things seemed to be going their way. Brian would reunite with his mum, and Tom would be free from the church's grip. But then, out of nowhere, Tom's mum showed up, along with 2 church members. They had been tracked down. Tom's stomach dropped, and Brian bolted out the back door, knowing exactly what that meant. Their escape was over. That was the last time Tom saw Brian, until about a year later. By then, everything had changed. Tom was isolated in the church for 2 weeks as punishment for trying to escape. After that, he was sent to Jonestown, personally escorted by Jim Jones himself. Brian eventually showed up there too. But by then, they both knew the chances of getting out had disappeared. Even though life in Jonestown was harsh, they found some freedom in the jungle surrounding the compound. They'd sneak off and explore, learning which plants were edible and how to find water. The jungle became their safe space. Back in the States, they had been troublemakers, but in Jonestown, people seemed to have forgotten all about that. That's when they started thinking seriously about running away again. At first, they dreamed about heading all the way back to the US, cutting through the jungle. Brian even suggested making it to Brazil and going to an embassy for help. But the reality of Jonestown began to set in, and their escape plans started to shift. Then came what Jim Jones called a white night. These were emergency drills Jim Jones would announce over the loudspeakers, claiming they were under attack by enemies, real or imagined. Everyone would have to gather at the pavilion and prepare for what Jones called revolutionary suicide. It was Jones testing the loyalty of his followers, and these drills sometimes included threats of mass suicide. People would be ordered to drink what was said to be poison, though it often wasn't. During one of these white nights, Jones announced that this time everyone was going to drink cyanide-laced punch and die. People were terrified. Brian and Tom sat close to the front, but they knew better. Brian had worked in the kitchen and helped prepare the drink. He knew it wasn't real poison this time. But they played along, knowing that someday it might not be a test. Their desperation to leave grew even stronger after that. Instead of trying to make it to the US, they set their sights on Matthews Ridge, a small military base about 30 miles away. From there, they could get to Georgetown and reach the American embassy. The plan felt risky, but it was their best shot. The day came, and they packed their supplies into gunny sacks, the same ones they used for collecting wood. No one suspected anything as they slipped into the jungle. After hours of walking, the sun set, and the jungle became too dark to navigate. They had to stop near the road. But it wasn't long before they heard a tractor from Jonestown rumbling along, searching for them. They stayed hidden as it passed, but then they heard voices. Guards from Jonestown. Stephan Jones, Jim Jones's son, was leading the group with a gun. There was no way out. Brian and Tom were caught. After a month of laying low, they were determined to try again. The time for escape was set for 2 weeks out. The plan was simple: escape through the jungle, but now the stakes were even higher. But right as they were gearing up to leave, things took a sharp turn. Congressman Leo Ryan, a member of the US House of Representatives from California's 11th District, was coming to Jonestown. Rumors were spreading that people were being held against their will, and Ryan wanted to see the truth for himself. For Tom, this was a golden opportunity. Ryan arrived with a small group: reporters, concerned family members, and others. At first, Jim Jones didn't want to let them in, but in the end, he had no choice. Once inside, they were treated to a well-rehearsed show. Music, laughter, smiles. Everything looked perfect. But behind the scenes, some people were desperate to get out. That night, 2 members, Vernon Gosney and Monica Bagby, passed a note to one of the reporters, pleading for help. That was the first real sign that something wasn't right. The next day, when Ryan and his group came back, more people stepped forward, asking to leave. This was Tom's chance. His family was leaving, and he knew it was time to go. But before they left, Tom saw his best friend, Brian Davis, standing with his father in the crowd. "Why don't you come with us?" Tom asked him. But Brian's face was blank, his eyes distant. "I can't go," he said quietly. His father was a loyal follower of Jim Jones, and Brian wasn't leaving him behind. Tom stood there stunned. His best friend, the guy who had always planned to escape with him, wasn't coming. That was the last time Tom and Brian spoke. As Tom and the defectors made their way to the airstrip, tension in Jonestown was rising fast. Larry Layton, one of Jones's most loyal followers, joined the group at the last minute, and almost immediately, things went wrong. Layton opened fire on the defectors, and shortly after, members of Jones's security team arrived at the airstrip with shotguns and rifles. Congressman Ryan and several others were killed. Tom and a few others managed to escape into the jungle, but Jonestown was about to fall into chaos. Back in Jonestown, after hearing about the attack on Ryan, Jim Jones knew the end was near. His paranoia had taken full control. He called everyone to the pavilion, just like he had done before during the White Knight drills. Only this time, it wasn't a drill. Jones's wife, Marceline Jones, tried to calm people over the loudspeakers, telling them everything was fine and asking them to return to their homes. But behind the scenes, the poison was being prepared. A large metal tub of grape flavor aid was mixed with a deadly cocktail of drugs, cyanide, tranquilizers, and sedatives. Jonestown's in-house doctor, Larry Schacht, was the one who had researched and prepared the poison. He had been working on this for a while, under Jones's orders, figuring out the most effective way to end so many lives. Once everything was ready, Jim Jones made the announcement over the PA system. It was time for everyone to gather at the pavilion. The mass suicide, which had been rehearsed before, was now going to be carried out for real. The first to step up were mothers with their children. A syringe without a needle was used to squirt the poison directly into the infants' mouths. For babies, death came almost instantly. For older children, it took a few minutes, and for adults, anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes. It was a horrific scene. People watched in horror as their children died in their arms. Jones stood at the front, telling everyone that this was the only way. There was no turning back. Tom wasn't there to witness it, but he later learned what had happened. Brian, like so many others, took the poison. The guards surrounded the pavilion, armed and ready to kill anyone who tried to run. Most people didn't fight back. They drank the poison, knowing there was no other choice. Brian's father, the loyal follower, stood by his side until the end. The scene at the airstrip was pure chaos. After the shootings, survivors scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. Journalist Tim Reiterman, who had been wounded himself, managed to capture haunting photos of the aftermath, people dead or dying, and others in shock. Back in Jonestown, the grim task of dealing with the dead began. Over 900 people had perished, including Jim Jones himself. The bodies, many of them children, lay scattered across the pavilion, a tragic reminder of how things had spiraled out of control. US military personnel were flown in to collect the dead and transport them back to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. The base had handled disasters before, but nothing on this scale. Overwhelmed, the team responsible for identifying and processing the bodies struggled with the emotional and physical toll, many suffering from PTSD in the years that followed. Of the 918 who died, most were flown back to the US, but not everyone was claimed by their families. In 2014, the cremated remains of 9 people were found in an old funeral home in Dover, unclaimed for decades. Their remains were eventually interred at the Jonestown Memorial in Oakland, California, along with the bodies of more than 400 other victims. Larry Layton, who had fired shots at the airstrip, was the only person held criminally responsible for the Jonestown tragedy. After his arrest in the US, he was convicted of conspiracy and aiding in the murder of Congressman Ryan. Paroled in 2002, he remains the only one ever brought to justice for what happened that day. But amidst the staggering numbers, it's the personal stories that stand out, like that of Brian Davis. Remember that photo we talked about earlier? The one where Brian stands on the far right, squinting into the sunlight, his face serious, almost uncertain. Now, knowing the full story, his expression feels more haunting than ever. Brian didn't make it out. He stood with his father, a loyal follower of Jim Jones, until the very end. When Tom saw Brian that last time, offering him the chance to escape, Brian refused. He couldn't leave his father. Hours later, Brian stood in line with the others, waiting to drink the poison that would take his life. That look of uncertainty, of seriousness in that photo, it makes sense now. Brian was caught between two worlds, the desire to escape and the pull of loyalty to his family. And tragically, in the end, that decision was made for him.